with the preliminary characterization of the thematic object of the investigation, the being of beings, or the meaning of being in general, its method too would appear to be already prescribed. The task of ontology is to set in relief the being of beings and to explicate being itself. And the method of ontology remains questionable in the highest degree, as long as we wish merely to consult historically transmitted ontologies or similar efforts. Since the term ontology is used in a formally broad sense for this investigation, the approach of clarifying its method by tracing the history of that method is automatically precluded. In using the term ontology, we do not specify any particular philosophical discipline standing in relation to other. It should not at all be our task to satisfy the demands of any established discipline. On the contrary, such a discipline can be developed only from the objective necessity of particular questions and procedures demanded by the things themselves. With the guiding question of the meaning of being, the investigation arrives at the fundamental question of philosophy in general. The treatment of this question is phenomenological. With this term, the treatise dictates for itself neither a standpoint nor a direction, because phenomenology is neither of these and can never be as long as it understands itself. The expression phenomenology signifies primarily a concept of method. It does not characterize the what of the objects of philosophical research in terms of their content, but the how of such research. The more genuinely effective a concept of method is, and the more comprehensively it determines the fundamental conduct of a science, the more originally is it rooted in confrontation with the things themselves, and the farther away it moves from what we call a technical device, of which there are many in the theoretical discipline. The term phenomenology expresses a maxim that can be formulated to the things themselves. It is opposed to all free-floating constructions and accidental findings. It is also opposed to taking over concepts only seemingly demonstrated, and likewise to pseudo-questions which often are spread abroad as problems for generation. But one might object that this maxim is, after all, abundantly self-evident, and moreover, an expression of the principle of all scientific knowledge. It is not clear why this commonplace should be explicitly put in the title of our research. In fact, we are dealing with something self-evident, which we want to get closer to, insofar as that is important for the clarification of the procedure in our treatise. We shall explicate only the preliminary concept of phenomenology. The expression has two components, phenomenon and logos. Both go back to the Greek terms cp, ivo micro, svov, and v709. Viewed extrinsically, the word phenomenology is formed like the terms theology, biology, sociology, translated as the science of God, of life, of the community. Accordingly, phenomenology would be the science of phenomena. The preliminary concept of phenomenology is to be exhibited by characterizing what is meant by the two components, phenomenon and logos, and by establishing the meaning of the word which is the result of their combination. The history of the word itself, which originated presumably with the Wolffian school, is not important here. The concept of phenomenon, the Greek expression cp a tvo micro, svov, from which the term phenomenon derives, comes from the verb cpafkdat, meaning to show itself. The cp a tvo micro evav means what shows itself, the self-showing, the manifest. Yafkamat itself is a middle voice construction of yafwa, to bring into daylight, to place in brightness. Cpafwa belongs to the root pa, like cpwg, light or brightness, that is, that within which something can become manifest, visible in itself. Thus the meaning of the expression phenomenon is established as what shows itself in itself, what is manifest. The pia tiv micro siva, phenomena, are thus the totality of what lies in the light of day or can be brought to light. Sometimes the Greeks simply identified this with tia avsha, being. Beings can show themselves from themselves in various ways, depending on the mode of access to them. The possibility even exists that they can show themselves as they are not in themselves. In this self-showing beings look like. Such self-showing situation we call seeming shanan. And so the expression pia tvo micro cvov, phenomenon, means in Greek what looks like something, what seems shanebar, semblance, shame. Cpia tvo micro, svov, and yi mv means a good that looks like, but in reality is not what it gives itself out to be. It is extremely important for a further understanding of the concept of phenomenon to see how what is named in both meanings of cpia tvo micro evolve, phenomenon, as self-showing and phenomenon as semblance, are structurally connected. Only because something claims to show itself in accordance with its meaning at all, that is, claims to be a phenomenon, can it show itself as something it is not, or can it only look like? The original meaning, phenomenon, what is manifest as a phenbear, already contains and is the basis of CP a TVO micro evolve, semblance. We attribute to the term phenomenon the positive and original meaning of CP a TVO micro, SVOV terminologically, and separate the phenomenon of semblance chain from it as a privative modification. But what both terms express has at first nothing at all to do with what is called appearance, Erscheinung, or even mere appearance, blow key Erscheinung. Thus, one speaks of appearances of symptoms of illness. What is meant by this are occurrences in the body that show themselves, and in this self-showing as such indicate something that does not show itself. When such occurrences emerge, their self-showing coincides with the presence vorhindensin of disturbances that do not show themselves. Appearance as the appearance of something, thus precisely does not mean that something shows itself. Rather, it means that something which does not show itself announces itself through something that does show itself. Appearing is a not showing itself. But this not must by no means be confused with the privative not which determines the structure of semblance. What does not show itself, in the manner of what appears, can also never seem. All indications, presentations, symptoms, and symbols have this fundamental formal structure of appearing, although they do differ among themselves. Although appearing is never self-showing in the sense of phenomenon, appearing is possible only on the basis of a self-showing of something. But this, the self-showing that makes appearing possible, is not appearing itself. Appearing is an announcing of itself through something that shows itself. If we then say that with the word appearance, we are pointing to something in which something appears without itself being an appearance, then the concept of phenomenon is not thereby delimited but presupposed. However, this presupposition remains hidden because the expression to appear in this definition of appearance is used in two senses. That in which something appears means that in which something makes itself known, that is, does not show itself in the expression without itself being an appearance. Appearance means the self-showing. But this self-showing essentially belongs to the wherein, in which something makes itself known. Accordingly, phenomena are never appearances, but every appearance is dependent upon phenomena. If we define phenomenon with the help of a concept of appearance that is still unclear, then everything is turned upside down, and a critique of phenomenology on this basis is surely a remarkable enterprise. The expression appearance itself in turn can have a double meaning. First, appearing in the sense of announcing itself as something that does not show itself, and second, in the sense of what does the announcing, that which in itself showing indicates something that does not show itself. Finally, one can use appearing as the term for the genuine meaning of phenomenon as self-showing. If one designates these three different states of affairs as appearance, confusion is inevitable. However, this confusion is considerably increased by the fact that appearance can take on still another meaning. If one understands that which does the announcing, that which in itself showing indicates the non-manifest as what comes to the fore in the non-manifest itself, and radiates from it in such a way that what is non-manifest is thought of as what is essentially never manifest. If this is so, then appearance is tantamount to production hervorbringung, or to what is produced hervorgebracht. However, this does not constitute the real being of the producing or productive hervorbringenden, but is rather appearance in the sense of mere appearance. What does the announcing and is brought forward indeed shows itself in such a way that, as the emanation of what it announces, it precisely and continually veils what it is in itself. But then again, this not showing which veils is not semblant. Kant uses the term appearance in this twofold way. On the one hand, appearances are for him the objects of empirical intuition, that which shows itself in intuition. This self-showing phenomenon in the genuine, original sense is, on the other hand, appearance as the emanation of something that makes itself known but conceals itself in the appearance. Since a phenomenon is constitutive for appearance, in the sense of announcing itself through a self-showing, and since this phenomenon can turn into semblance in a privative way, appearance can also turn into mere semblance. Under a certain kind of light, someone can look as if he were flushed. The redness that shows itself can be taken as announcing the presence of fever. This in turn would indicate a disturbance in the organism. Phenomenon, the self-showing in itself, means a distinctive way something can be encountered. On the other hand, appearance means a referential relation in beings themselves such that what does the referring, the announcing, can fulfill its possible function only if it shows itself in itself, only if it is a phenomenon. Both appearance and semblance are themselves founded in the phenomenon, albeit in different ways. The confusing multiplicity of phenomena, designated by the terms phenomenon, semblance, appearance, and mere appearance, can be unraveled only if the concept of phenomenon is understood from the very beginning as the self-showing in itself. But if in the way we grasp the concept of phenomenon we leave undetermined which beings are to be addressed as phenomena, and if we leave altogether open whether the self-showing is actually a particular being or a characteristic of the being of beings, then we are dealing solely with the formal concept of phenomena. If by the self-showing we understand those beings that are accessible, for example, through empirical intuition in Kant's sense, then the formal concept of phenomenon can be used legitimately. In this usage, phenomenon has the meaning of the vulgar concept of phenomenon. But this vulgar concept is not the phenomenological concept of phenomenon. In the horizon of the Kantian problematic, what is understood phenomenologically by the term phenomenon, disregarding other differences, can be illustrated when we say that what already shows itself in appearances, prior to and always accompanying what we commonly understand as phenomena, though unthematically, can be brought thematically to self-showing. What thus shows itself in itself, the forms of intuition, are the phenomena of phenomenology. For clearly, space and time must be able to show themselves in this way. They must be able to become phenomena if Kant claims to make a valid transcendental statement when he says that space is the priori, wherein, of an ordering. Now, if the phenomenological concept of phenomenon is to be understood at all, regardless of how the self-showing may be more closely determined, we must inevitably presuppose insight into the sense of the formal concept of phenomenon and the legitimate use of phenomenon in its vulgar meaning. However, before determining the preliminary concept of phenomenology, we must delimit the meaning of V709 in order to make clear in which sense phenomenology can be a science of phenomena. B. The concept of logos, the concept of, has many meanings in Plato and Aristotle, indeed in such a way that these meanings diverge without a basic meaning positively taking the lead. This is in fact only an illusion which lasts so long as an interpretation is not able to grasp adequately the basic meaning in its primary content. If we say that the basic meaning of his discourse Bede, this literal translation becomes valid only when we define what discourse itself means. The later history of the word, and especially the manifold and arbitrary interpretations of subsequent philosophy, constantly conceal the authentic meaning of discourse, which is manifest enough, is translated, and that always means interpreted, as reason, judgment, concept, definition, ground, relation. But how can discourse be so susceptible of modification that means all the things mentioned, and indeed in scholarly usage? Even if is understood in the sense of a statement, and statement as meant, this apparently correct translation can still miss the fundamental meaning, especially if judgment is understood in the sense of some contemporary theory of judgment. It does not mean judgment, in any case not primarily, if by judgment we understand connecting two things or taking a position, by endorsing or rejecting. Rather, as discourse really means in Elkov, to make manifest what is being talked about in discourse. Aristotle explicates this function of discourse more precisely as V709, let something be seen, namely what is being talked about, and indeed for the speaker, who serves as the medium, or for those who speak with each other. Discourse lets us see, auto from itself, what is being talked about. In discourse eido, pav, insofar as it is genuine, what is said should be derived from what is being talked about. In this way, spoken communication, in what it says, makes manifest what it is talking about and thus makes it accessible to another. Such is the structure of tilde 6 yog as autowakpeving. Not every discourse suits this mode of making manifest, in the sense of letting something be seen by indicating it. For example, requesting SVXRL also makes something manifest, but in a different way. When fully concrete, discourse, letting something be seen, has the character of speaking or vocalization in words. K709 is yo, VRL. Indeed, CPW VRL microstia CPAFSHIA vocalization, in which something always is cited. Only because the function of as and irikpavung lies in letting something be seen. By indicating it can zoolog have the structure of 6VV1 E6NS. Here synthesis does not mean to connect and conjoin representations, to manipulate psychical occurrences, which then gives rise to the problem of how these connections, as internal, correspond to what is external and physical. The 6VV here has a purely epiphanical meaning, to let something be seen in its togetherness with something, to let something be seen as something. Furthermore, because V709 lets something be seen, it can therefore be true or false. But everything depends on staying clear of any concept of truth construed in the sense of correspondence or accordance, Übereinstimmung. This idea is by no means the primary one in the concept of the being true of X6 Yog as Act TL and Vedi means. To take beings that are being talked about in X Isti as Adikpaf 6T tilde at out of their concealment, to let them be seen as something unconcealed, 6C XRLI 9ES, to discover them. Similarly, being false, or U86 is tantamount to deceiving in the sense of covering up, putting something in front of something else, by way of letting it be seen, and thereby passing it off as something it is not. But because truth has this meaning, and because is a specific mode of letting something be seen, Zoyag simply may not be appealed to as the primary place of truth. If one defines truth as what genuinely pertains to judgment, which is quite customary today, and if one invokes Aristotle in support of this thesis, such a procedure is without justification, and the Greek concept of truth thoroughly misunderstood. In the Greek sense, what is true indeed more originally true than the Zoyag we have been discussing is Al6I9 RLRNG, the simple sense perception of something. The extent that an OCF Merling aims at its L and Ta, that is, the beings which are genuinely accessible only through it and for it. For example, looking at colors perception is always true. This means that looking always discovers colors, hearing always discovers tone. What is in the purest and most original sense true, that is, what only discovers in such a way that it can never cover up anything, is pure vasive, straightforwardly observant apprehension of the simplest determinations of the being of beings as such. This vasive can never cover up, can never be false, at worst it can be a non-apprehending, and Ivo Eve, not sufficing for straightforward, appropriate access. What no longer takes the form of a pure letting be seen, but rather in its indicating always has recourse to something else, and so always lets something be seen as something, acquires with this structure of synthesis the possibility of covering up. However, truth of judgment is only the opposite case of this covering up. It is a phenomenon of truth. Realism and idealism alike thoroughly miss the meaning of the Greek concept of truth, from which alone the possibility of something like a theory of ideas can be understood as philosophical knowledge. And because the function of Zoos lies in letting something be seen straightforwardly, in letting beings be apprehended, can mean reason. Furthermore, because Zoyag is used in the sense not only of but also of Keyo micro evov, what is pointed to as such, and because the latter is nothing other than the B7 tox fvav, what always already lies present at the basis of all relevant speech and discussion, Zoyag qua means ground ratio. Finally, because Zoyag as can also mean what is addressed, as something that has become visible in its relation to something else in its relatedness. Zoos acquires the meaning of relation and relationship. This interpretation of epiphantic speech may suffice to clarify the primary function of C, the preliminary concept of phenomenology, when one brings to mind concretely what has been exhibited in the interpretation of phenomenon and logos. One is struck by an inner relation between what is meant by these terms. The expression phenomenology can be formulated in Greek as tilde, istikawaya tvo microeva. But X, usti means hence phenomenology means, 6 sidikpaf e6 tia tia cp a tvo micro evadu, let what shows itself be seen from itself, just as it shows itself from itself. That is the formal meaning of the type of research that calls itself phenomenology. But this expresses nothing other than the maxim formulated above, to the things themselves. Accordingly, the term phenomenology differs in meaning from such expressions as theology and the like. Such titles designate the objects of the respective disciplines in terms of their content. Phenomenology neither designates the object of its researchers, nor is it a title that describes their content. The word only tells us something about the how of the demonstration and treatment of what this discipline considers. Science of the phenomena means that it grasps its objects in such a way that everything about them to be discussed must be directly indicated and directly demonstrated. The basically tautological expression, descriptive phenomenology, has the same sense. Your description does not mean a procedure like that of, say, botanical morphology. The term rather has the sense of a prohibition, insisting that we avoid all non-demonstrative determination. The character of description itself, the specific sense of these OOS, can be established only from the content, Sachheit, of what is described, that is, of what is to be brought to scientific determinateness in the way phenomena are encountered. The meaning of the formal and vulgar concept of the phenomenon formally justifies our calling every way of indicating beings, as they show themselves in themselves, phenomenology. Now what must be taken into account if the formal concept of phenomenon is to be deformalized to the phenomenological one, and how does this differ from the vulgar concept? What is it that phenomenology is to let be seen? What is it that is to be called phenomenon in a distinctive sense? What is it that, by its very essence, becomes the necessary theme when we indicate something explicitly? Manifestly, it is something that does not show itself initially, and for the most part, something that is concealed verb origin in contrast to what initially, and for the most part, does show itself. But at the same time, it is something that essentially belongs to what initially and for the most part shows itself, indeed in such a way that it constitutes its meaning and ground. But what remains concealed in an exceptional sense, or what falls back and is covered up vertikung again, or shows itself only in a disguised, verstelt way, is not this or that being but rather, as we have shown in our foregoing observations, the being of being. It can be covered up to such a degree that it is forgotten, and the question about it, and its meaning altogether omitted. Thus, phenomenology has taken into its grasp, thematically, as its object that which, in terms of its own most content, demands that it become a phenomenon in a distinct sense. Phenomenology is the way of access to, and the demonstrative manner of determination of, that which is to become the theme of ontology. Ontology is possible only as phenomenology. The phenomenological concept of phenomenon as self-showing means the being of beings, its meaning, modifications, and derivative. This self-showing is nothing arbitrary, nor is it something like an appearing. The being of beings can least of all be something behind which something else stands, something that does not appear. Essentially, nothing else stands behind the phenomena of phenomenology. Nevertheless, what is to become a phenomenon can be concealed. And it is precisely because phenomena are initially, and for the most part not given that phenomenology is needed. Being covered up is the counter-concept to phenomenon. There are various ways phenomena can be covered up. In the first place, a phenomenon can be covered up in the sense that it is still completely undiscovered. There is neither knowledge nor lack of knowledge about it. Moreover, a phenomenon can be submerged vertitet. This means it was once discovered, but then got covered up again. This covering up can be total, but more commonly, what was once discovered may still be visible, though only as semblance. However, where there is semblance there is being. This covering up as dissimulation, Verstellung, is the most frequent and the most dangerous kind, because here the possibilities of being deceived and misled are especially pernicious. Within a system, the structures and concepts of being that are available, but concealed with respect to their autochthony, may perhaps claim their rights. On the basis of their integrated structure in a system, they present themselves as something clear, which is in no need of further justification, and which therefore can serve as a point of departure for a process of deduction. The covering up itself, whether it be understood in the sense of concealment, being submerged or disguised, has in turn a twofold possibility. There are accidental coverings and necessary ones, the latter grounded in the enduring nature of the discoverer. It is possible for every phenomenological concept and proposition, drawn from genuine origins, to degenerate when communicated as a statement. It gets circulated in a vacuous fashion, loses its autochthony, and becomes a free-floating thesis. Even in the concrete work of phenomenology itself, there lurks the possibility of a calcification, and of the inability to grasp what was originally grasped. And the difficulty of this research consists precisely in making itself critical in a positive sense. The way of encountering being, and the structures of being in the mode of phenomenon, must first be wrested from the objects of phenomenology. Thus the point of departure of the analysis, the access to the phenomenon, and passage through the prevalent coverings must secure their own method. The idea of an originary and intuitive grasp and explication of phenomena must be opposed to the naivete of an accidental, immediate, and unreflective beholding. On the basis of the preliminary concept of phenomenology just delimited, the terms phenomenal and phenomenological can now be given fixed meaning. What is given and is explicable in the way we encounter the phenomenon is called phenomenal. In this sense, we speak of phenomenal structure, everything that belongs to the manner of indication and explication, and that constitutes the conceptuality this research requires, is called phenomenological. Because phenomenon in the phenomenological understanding is always just what constitutes being, And furthermore, because being is always the being of beings, we must first of all bring beings themselves forward in the right way if we are to have any prospect of exposing being. These beings must likewise show themselves in the way of access that genuinely belongs to them. Thus, the vulgar concept of phenomenon becomes phenomenologically relevant. The preliminary task of phenomenologically securing that being which is to serve as our example, as the point of departure for the analysis proper, is always already prescribed by the goal of this analysis. As far as content goes, phenomenology is the science of the being of beings ontology. In our elucidation of the task of ontology, the necessity arose for a fundamental ontology, which would have as its theme that being which is ontologically and ontically distinctive, namely, Dasein. This must be done in such a way that our ontology confronts the cardinal problem, the question of the meaning of being in from the investigation itself. We shall see that the methodological meaning of phenomenological description is interpretation. The phenomenology of Dasein has the character of epiphysty, through which the proper meaning of being and the basic structures of the very being of Dasein are made known to the understanding of being that belongs to Dasein itself. Phenomenology of Dasein is hermeneutics in the original signification of that word, which designates the work of interpretation. But since the discovery of the meaning of being and of the basic structures of Dasein in general exhibits the horizon for every further ontological research into beings unlike Dasein, the present hermeneutic is at the same time hermeneutics, in the sense that it works out the conditions of the possibility of every ontological investigation. Finally, insofar as Dasein has ontological priority over all other beings, as a being in the possibility of existence hermeneutics, as the interpretation of the being of Dasein, receives the third specific and, philosophically understood, primary meaning of an analysis of the existentiality of existence. The extent that this hermeneutic elaborates the historicity of Dasein ontologically as the ontic condition of the possibility of the discipline of history, it contains the roots of what can be called hermeneutics, only in a derivative sense, the methodology of the historical humanistic discipline. As the fundamental theme of philosophy, being is not a genus of beings, yet it pertains to every being. Its universality must be sought in a higher sphere. Being and its structure transcend every being and every possible existent determination of a being. Being is the transcendence pure, and the transcendence of the being of Dasein is a distinctive one since in it lies the possibility and necessity of the most radical individuation. Every disclosure of being as the transcendence is transcendental knowledge. Phenomenological truth, disclosedness of being, is veritas transcendentalis. Ontology and phenomenology are not two different disciplines, which among others belong to philosophy. Both terms characterize philosophy itself, its object and procedure. Philosophy is universal phenomenological ontology, taking its departure from the hermeneutic of Dasein, which, as an analysis of existence T has fastened the end of the guideline of all philosophical inquiry at the point from which it arises and to which it returns. The following investigations would not have been possible without the foundation laid by Edmund Husserl. With his logical investigations, phenomenology achieved a breakthrough. Our elucidations of the preliminary concept of phenomenology show that its essential character does not consist in its actuality as a philosophical movement. Higher than actuality stands possibility. We can understand phenomenology solely by seizing upon it as a possibility. With regard to the awkwardness and inelegance of expression in the following analyses, we may remark that it is one thing to report narratively about beings and another to grasp beings in their being. For the latter task, not only most of the words are lacking, but above all the grammar. If we may allude to earlier and in their own right altogether incomparable researches on the analysis of being, then we should compare the ontological sections in Plato's Parmenides, or the 4th chapter of the 7th book of Aristotle's Metaphysics, with a narrative passage from Thucydides. Then we can see the stunning character of the formulation with which their philosophers challenged the Greeks. Since our powers are essentially inferior, and also since the area of being to be disclosed ontologically is far more difficult than that presented to the Greeks, the complexity of our concept formation and the severity of our expression will increase.